Hello everybody and welcome to the third lecture of our course on action research with children at risk in a community context. In week 1, we looked at the question, what is action research? In week 2, we moved on in our inquiry and looked at the question, what is an action research process? Hopefully by now, through your readings and through the lectures that you've listened to, as well as the discussion and dialogue posts you've been having on the Moodle platform, you have been able to acquire the vocabulary of action research, as well as get introduced to its thought processes. Well, true to the spirit of action research, this week we're going to jump straight into our projects and also begin to do something about action research. What better way to learn about action research than by doing actions of research? So the objectives for this lecture are to give you tools and methods to begin the first step of your project. The first step in an action research project is to identify a problem worthy of both action and research. So the question that we're going to address this week is how to identify an action research problem. Alice McIntyre, in her book Participatory Action Research, writes, practitioners of participatory action research engage in a variety of research projects in a variety of contexts using a wide range of research practices that are related to an equally wide range of political ideologies. Yet there are underlying tenets that are specific to the field of practitioners' action research, and that inform the majority of projects. A collective commitment to investigate an issue or problem. B, a desire to engage in self and collective reflection to gain clarity about the issue under investigation. C, joint decision to engage in individual and or collective action that leads to a useful solution that benefits the people involved. And finally, D, the building of alliances between researchers and participants in the planning, implementation, and dissemination of the research process. I think it's a fantastic quote. It beautifully captures the key elements of the first stage. It talks about a collective commitment to investigate an issue or problem. We'll talk a bit more about it, how the problem that you're going to investigate has to be your problem as a researcher and equally a problem for the stakeholders. A problem that's worthy of useful action in the world as well as of research. And also, secondly, it talks about a desire to engage in self-reflection and collective reflection. Actually, I'll be introducing you to what I have called the reflective cycle that does precisely this. Because we want to make sure that the problem is not just a superficial problem or it's not someone else's problem. So the researcher and the stakeholders go through a process of reflection to be able to dig out of their own lives the centrality of the problem we want to investigate. And finally, it also talks about how jointly we're going to engage in finding solutions and also together as researchers and stakeholders we're able to disseminate the research process and bring about change and also contribute to knowledge. In my own work, I have called it the reflective cycle, the first stage of research. This is absolutely essential because the first person who needs to buy into the research project is you, the researcher. And you need to own your research. The reflective cycle has three main components. Firstly, reflective thinking. So you begin to reflect deeply upon your own lived experiences, particularly in relationship to children at risk and holistic child development, and identify a semantically dense event or an event that is meaningful for you, an event that's unforgettable or memorable, something that's affected you deeply. And that will help you to demarcate a field of investigation, something that matters to you. So reflective thinking is primarily for you to identify a problem in this area which you consider worthy of pursuit. Of course, we got to do reflective interviewing to get the same kind of responses from the stakeholders as well. Secondly, narrative writing. You will articulate this semantically dense event, the event that impacted you in history. It could be 5 years back, 10 years back, it could be very recently, something that really touched you, that impacted you. And you're going to articulate it in a narratival form. And as you write it, certain themes that will evolve out of it. The problem will come out as you articulate this event. And these themes and problems will actually reveal the question that you seek to address in your research project. So you write out a story of the event that impacted you the most. Thirdly, once you've kind of identified the problem and you've kind of abstracted a theme, you do cursory reading of literature in holistic child development and literature on children at risk to look for the academic equivalent or the academic thematic of the theme and the problem that you have observed and realized from the real lived world. Okay, so what are the goals of the reflective cycle? In my view, there are 4 goals. The first goal is to finalize your research context. So you need to identify who you're going to research upon. With whom are you going to do action research? It could be a project amongst children at risk. It could be belonging to an NGO or an FBO. It could be a project that you have initiated and you run. But you need a research context. And I cannot stress enough the importance of finalizing a research context this week. Because if you do not have a research context on children at risk, we really cannot go forward and do anything more. So for some of you who are distanced from a lived practical project or program amongst children at risk, you need to probably get on your phones or ask around, do some visits, and find a project that you could work with. The second goal is to identify a research problem in the project. The third goal is for you to then use narratival writing of the problem and abstract the research theme and question out of your narrative. And the final goal is to abstract the research thematic from the holistic child development literature. And I'm sure as part of your course, you have plenty of literature on holistic child development. Okay, so let's begin with the first component of reflective thinking. I'm reminded of the story of what I call children under the bridge. When I used to land in the Delhi airport and you take a cab, the first stretch is beautiful roads with great landscaping on both sides of the road. lovely trees, and now actually it's much more better. So anyone driving out of the airport looks at Delhi with wonder and enjoys its beauty. But then you get on to another road, and as you drive into the city, especially if you're going towards South Delhi, Vasant Vihar and Munirka, then you have to, in those days, go under a flyover as you take a right. And I remember this again and again, that each time the car would take a right, on the left hand side under the flyover, there would be children playing. You've just come into the city and you have just enjoyed the beauty of what Delhi's best had to offer you, and suddenly the stark reality of children under the bridge hits you. I have contemplated upon this many a time. The activist in you wants to stop the car, go back, and do something about those children. The researcher in you wants to go away and ponder deeply about the problems the city of Delhi has that allows children to be homeless amidst its great wealth. Now, in my view, action research brings both of this together. You need to identify your children under the bridge that keep you awake at night. In this world, we face many problems. All of us have problems. But there are problems and problems. There are some problems that keep you awake at night. And this is the time for you to reflect deeply and think, in the context of children and children at risk, what problem about the children keeps you awake at night? What problem has affected you deeply? There was another incident of children playing in a park, slum children, and this was in the north part of Delhi. And we had never seen the slum because there was a wall that was put up to block the view of the slum in order to protect the property rights in the neighborhood. And one day, we saw children playing across the road in a park with tattered clothes, and pausing there and engaging those children and seeing their eagerness to learn birthed the project of Shiksha Rath many years ago. So something about the children, their needs, must affect you or must have already affected you, and you need to dig it out of yourself. Therefore, it's important to know your research context, where you're going to bring about some effects. So in your reflective thinking, you've identified a key event from the past that moved you, that gave you probably sleepless nights, that affected you. And from that, many problems, you identify one key problem worthy of pursuing. And now, because it's action research, in a research context where there are other stakeholders, the problem is not just yours, but you have to make sure that the problem is shared by your stakeholders. So we have to do what is called reflective interviews in order to get their stories. You have your story about children, they have their stories. And in this comparative sharing of stories, and in your reflection of these stories, you will be able to identify a problem worthy of pursuit, both for action and research. So let me reiterate. You have to identify a research context on one hand, while on the other hand, through reflective thinking from your past experiences, and secondly, from the experience of that research context and its stakeholders, you're going to arrive and decide upon a problem to work with. Now, this is what Sagar has to say about the problem formulation stage of the action research project. He writes, and I quote, "The time demands of instruction, in-service, training, and program improvement leave little time for the reflection necessary to develop a truly meaningful research question. Yet it is essential that collaborative action researchers have sufficient time to accomplish this crucial step. Our experience has shown that teachers who rush to complete the problem formulation stage are more likely to flounder in their later efforts, whereas teachers who take time to reflect on and define their problem are more likely to pursue questions yielding meaningful results." I cannot agree more with Sagar on this point of taking time to identify your research problem leading to your theme and your research question. So Sagar provides two techniques for discovering the key problem worthy of being resolved. Number one, he calls it reflective interviewing of stakeholders. So we have already talked about reflective thinking. So this is all part of that stage. It began with you, and now it involves the stakeholders as well. The issue involves children at risk in a community context. The issue is something that you can influence, and the issue is something I, as a researcher, am deeply concerned about. So these are the three factors that Sagar tells us to keep in mind. Firstly, that the issue, the problem, it revolves around the domain of children at risk for us, or the field for him was education and teaching. Secondly, that it's an issue that you can influence. Now here, on a side, I must make this point. The research context you choose must be a context which you can influence. You cannot just walk into a project with children and expect the stakeholders to listen to you unless you have some relationship with them and unless you actually have permission and access to influence the processes in the program. So therefore, you must be able to identify a problem that you can practically address in the project. If you have no access, or what you're going to say is not going to matter to the stakeholders, then that's not a research context to choose for you. And thirdly, like we had already said, through reflective thinking, the problem is something that you're deeply concerned about. It is definitely your children under the bridge. Okay, so he gives a few cues for interviews, reflective interviews with the stakeholders. He says, make the interview comfortable but challenging. Keep it challenging but not threatening. Try to elicit deep responses and broad responses. And keep the interview somewhat structured but allow for flexibility and spontaneity. Consider the rights and feelings of the respondent. So here, a few quick tips. You should have a recording device when you're interviewing. That means you must know a research project. You've identified the key stakeholders, maybe a staff, maybe someone in the management team, maybe a child, maybe a parent, and someone in the community where the child belongs to. So you identified the key stakeholders, you got representatives. This is just the initial bit, but you got representatives, one or two, and then you interview them. You set out a few questions for them, and then you allow them to respond. And may I suggest that you should record them so that later you could transcribe and you won't miss anything. Otherwise you'll be so busy writing down what they're saying that you won't be able to actually do a good interview. So it's going to be very exciting. You're going to become a journalist. You're going to go out and you're going to interview. You're going to take notes as well. But you need to prepare for that. So the purpose of the reflective interview is to enable the stakeholders to get in touch with those core issues of practice that matter to them. You see, you're actually helping them. You're helping them reflect and think through their main problems. If this is properly done, the stakeholders will be very pleased with you because you're actually adding value to their program. So surfacing personal concerns early in the process is important because in today's world, people are disinclined to invest even small amounts of time and energy on projects or inquiries that seem tangential to their core concerns. So part of the reason why we do this is also we are having a buy-in with the stakeholders. They realize that the problem is important for them, and you realize that. If the problem was not important for them, then they're not going to work on it. But the moment through this interviewing, through this reflective interviewing, they are able to see that this is an important problem. For example, I shared last week with Shiksharat, when we did those initial interviews, we found out that the leadership team had a vision, and yet in their practice they were not able to fulfill it with regard to the faith component. So it was a real issue. And through reflective interviewing, they realized that, wow, we need help to fulfill our vision. So that brought them in to the Action Research project. Another and perhaps an equally important reason for conducting the reflective interview is to emphasize upfront that it is the stakeholders, the actors, who are driving this collaborative action research process. If they expect you as an outsider, as a researcher, to come and solve their problems, it's not going to happen. You're going to work with them through a process, but it's they who are part of the project who are going to actually bring resolution to the problems. So below, Alice McIntyre lists a few questions that can generate data. But feel free to write up your own questions. She gives a list of questions. What do you perceive as a problem or an issue in your community that needs to be addressed? That's a good general question to begin with. How does it relate to your own life and to the community's life? Why do you think these problems exist? What do you think we can do about these problems? What do we need to know more about these problems? Background of these problems. Why are they there? What do we already know? What resources do we need to proceed for the resolution of these problems? How will this project benefit the participants and the rest of the community? What are the common themes that are being generated in the project? Now, these are some of the questions that you can ask, and to get the preliminary data from the stakeholders as to what they consider is a worthy problem. Sagar then gives another tool. He calls it the analytical discourse. For him, he says, once you have done this preliminary round of reflective interviewing, then you take a key stakeholder and you ask critical questions. You ask questions that will bring out the complete story, but you warn them that it's going to be a step deeper than the initial interview. And this is what he says. The stakeholder should be able to say at the end of the interview, that's it. I have fully explained to you what I understand about this problem and all its parts. So it's an exhaustive interviewing. So here you're asking all the tough questions. And because they are forewarned, they don't mind it. So completing an analytic discourse allows the action research team to find out whether its members share an interest in a general topic and if the problem is worthy of addressing and is beneficial to the stakeholders if it is addressed. Okay? Now, in the first component of reflective thinking, you have your own story, your children under the bridge, the problems that excite you. You've got the problems and the stories from the research context, the project you're going to work with, and from the stakeholders. Now, once you've got these data, now we're going to move to the second component of narrative writing. You got to write out the research problem as a narrative. From the interviews, write it out from the perspective of the stakeholders as well as from your own perspective. So you're writing out a few stories, your own story and the stakeholders' story. But the way you write it out, the first, I'm going to give you an outline for how to do it. It's a 4-part outline. The first part is called description. So you describe the story. You just write out the story as you heard and for yourself as you reflected. So you have maybe a paragraph for the key event that was important for you about children. And similarly, you have collected those events from your stakeholders. So you just describe it. Secondly, when they described it, you would ask them questions about their feelings. How did they feel towards it? What were their reactions to those key events? And for yourself as well. So the next part is to capture their feelings. Now this is important because it shows the buy-in. How important was the event? Thirdly, once you've got the events, the feelings, then you do the work of abstraction. You put language to the problems being expressed. You abstract and put in short sentences the problem that you see emerging out of both your as well as the stakeholders' stories. And out of that problem, you abstract a theme. You abstract a theme. A theme could be a word or a phrase. It could be, you saw children under the bridge, they were playing. So homelessness could be a theme. Poverty could be another theme. Inequality of wealth could be another theme. A theme that struck you about the represented problem. And once you have done that, in the last part, you raise the question. You raise the question on the theme that represents the problem well. So you convert the problem into a question format. Okay? So we began on the ground with yourself through reflective thinking and through reflective interviews and analytic discourse. We got the data from the stakeholders about the problems of the project. And now through narrative writing, you're actually putting pen to paper and you're using the narrative form and you're writing out and collecting the data to make sense of it. The goal is to identify a research problem, a research theme, and a research question that arises. Hope this is useful, because without this, we cannot really go forward. Now, once you have done that, we come to the last point, the last component, which is cursory reading of the literature on holistic child development, children at risk, in order to find out the academic thematic, the academic language that represents the theme on the ground. Now, you have holistic child development, children at risk literature. You may already have literature on it, or you'll have to hunt and get some more. And then you're going to look at the key people, the giants as it were in the field, but who have addressed your theme in the writing. So as you put that together, you're going to get a bibliography, which is going to be important for the next stage. And then as you survey and scan the literature, that's why it's called cursory reading. You don't want to spend too much time on it. You're going to read fast, you're going to look at the contents page, you're going to look at the blurbs in the back of the cover, you're going to look at reviews, you're going to look at the introduction which summarizes the book. You don't have time to read all the books. You're going to survey it, scan it, to go to the key sections that does talk about your theme. And then you're looking to find the academic language in which it's represented. So at the end of it, you have a research thematic. And slowly you find that different authors are talking about the same thing. For example, a research thematic could be the term action research. Until now, we've come across at least 6 to 8 different authors who talk differently about action research. So in the literature on research, on methodologies, research methodologies, one methodology is called action research. So that could be a thematic if you're going to write a paper on research methodologies. And then you find there are plenty of authors talking about action research in different ways. Similarly now, that was just an example in terms of holistic child development and children at risk. You get the different authors and find out the thematic they use, the language they use to talk about the problem and the theme that you're concerned about. Sometimes it'll be very different. For example, you want to talk about how does the child, a homeless child, feel? That is important for you. How can you make sure that they are happy? But that's not written out in academic language. So you have that thought, you have that problem, that question that came out of the project. But now what you do is you actually get into the literature. And maybe it talks about child psychology. Maybe it brings about a thematic that has to do with, I don't know, maybe happiness index of children or well-being of children. So you see the language, the vocabulary changes. Academics have different vocabulary for the same thing. But the goal is to identify the academic research thematic. Okay, so in conclusion, so what do we have at the end of the reflective cycle? Number 1, we have a research context, clearly. Number 2, the research problem. Number 3, the research theme. All of this from the ground, from your own reflective thinking, from the reflective interviews with the stakeholders in the project, and your narrative writing. But then you take the theme and go do cursory reading and get number 4, research thematic. And because you have surveyed different books, finally number 5, you get a bibliography on children at risk within holistic child development. I know we have moved really fast and deep, and I really hope that this week you would be able to identify and decide on your research context, the project, and you'll be able to do reflective thinking of yourself and do a few reflective interviews of stakeholders and be able to write out your 1,000 word script following the outline I've discussed here in the lecture as well as given in your class video. Have a wonderful week, and if you have any questions, do write. Enjoy.